Hello, I'm making this video in response to MrRepzion's response to Anita Sarkeesian's second part of her Damsels in Distress video series. I was not aware of MrRepzion before making this video. I watched Sarkeesian's third video the other night, thought it was pretty good. Looked at the related videos and out of curiosity clicked on one of them. I'm well aware of the backlash Sarkeesian has gotten due to her Damsel in Distress series, but I've never been impressed with the criticism. I skipped to somewhere in the middle of MrRepzion's video to get an example of the sort of argument he was making in response and was inspired to respond. Now, I've broken up MrRepzion's video into 28 individual arguments and will rebut each one at a time. Please watch with annotations enabled, as additional information or any needed edits will be presented there. MrRepzion's primary error in his video is that he misrepresents and misunderstands the purpose of Sarkeesian's Damsel in Distress video series. Many of his arguments are therefore either strawman arguments, unrelated to the clip of Sarkeesian's video that he is replying to in each of his sections, or irrelevant to the greater context of Sarkeesian's point. Sarkeesian's argument, presented in her Damsel in Distress video series, defines and explores the damsel in distress trope, the extent of its ubiquity, and the role that its presence plays in the larger social context.
But that's not the issue. The issue is that this woman who somehow stupid people, managed to donate $150,000 to this woman who doesn't even list her sources academically or where she's got them, but she doesn't even give credit to the people whose videos that she took without their permission, without giving them credit for their videos that they made, which not only that, but she hasn't even played the games that she's actually listing.
This is irrelevant to Sarkeesian's point. It's not her intention to analyze the intimate details of how each instance of the trope is handled. She's making a larger point on the ubiquity of the damsel in distress trope throughout the gaming industry, and lists many games in order to demonstrate this. In regards to Let's Play videos being used, even if this is the case, it is, again, irrelevant to her point. Let's Playing itself and the concept of ownership over these videos is a very gray area. Nintendo, for example, may disagree with you. I would say that her claim of fair use is valid, and that your criticism of that, invalid. In regards to her video clips, her citation obligations are met. She cites the game, and by proxy the developers, the true owners of the content.
This is out of context. This game, Time Splitter's Future's Perfect, if you've ever played it, was a fantastic, hilarious game. The game had a ton of humor. The game was hilarious. It was not meant to be taken seriously. In fact, this scene of this woman strapped to the railroad is actually a parody of film and cinema of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. You know, back in the Western, when you had old Western black and white movies, how the villain would grab the woman, strap her to the railroad, and then the cowboy with his horse and trusty revolver would have to come save the woman. The damsel in distress, you gotta save the girl. Back in old-time cinema. Yeah, this particular scene in the video game is a parody of that. It's poking fun at how overly used it is.
The problem with your argument is that the clip you show from the game does not demonstrate a subversion of the damsel in distress trope. I would argue that it, instead, plays the trope pretty straight. The gender roles end up identical, hell, the groovy guy in the end even gets the girl. Your argument here is that Sarkeesian is unjustified in using Time Splitter's Future Perfect as an example of the damsel in distress trope. However, your attempt at special pleading was not sufficiently substantiated, and your criticism is not valid. Other clips from Sarkeesian's videos are relevant.
Now, it might be tempting to think that the damsel in distress was just a product of its time, and that by now, surely the trope must be a thing of the past. Well, while we have seen a moderate increase in the number of playable female characters, the plot device hasn't gone away. In fact, the damsel in distress has seen a bit of a resurgence in recent years. Sometimes this type of self-referential humor is referred to as ironic sexism. It's the I know, that I know, this is sexist, wherein the underlying assumption on the part of media makers seems to be that as long as a sexism is overt, obvious, or over the top, then it somehow loses its cultural power and is suddenly no longer a problem. Ironic sexism is dependent upon the false assumption that people no longer really hold retrograde sexist beliefs, and therefore the very idea of sexism is now just a hilarious joke. But nothing could be further from the truth. Words like parody and satire are often thrown around to describe or defend these comedic depictions of yet more helpless female characters. But a simple wink and nod to the audience acknowledging a sexist trope, while actively reproducing that trope, does not automatically grant a free pass to continue exploiting the trope. Now, some will no doubt contend that jokes have no cultural power or significance, and should just not be taken seriously. This is nothing new. Making light of and dismissing gender issues is a sad, time-honored tradition. But I would argue that this reaction fundamentally misunderstands how humor functions as one of the primary means by which the culture of sexism is maintained and perpetuated. Mass media entertainment doesn't just reflect our culture, it also works to create it. Sexist jokes in particular serve as a form of cultural permission, which help entrench toxic pre-existing attitudes and opinions. Of course, humor can also be a powerful tool with which to challenge or break down harmful gender myths, but that is much harder to pull off and must be done with careful intentionality. There is a clear difference between sexist parody and parody of sexism. Sexist parody encourages the players to mock and trivialize gender issues, while parody of sexism disrupts the status quo and undermines regressive gender conventions.
The game is actually, contextually, this particular scene where she's taking off her clothes, she is being detained with other men, with other children, with other women. Yes, that particular scene in this game, she is contained with a bunch of other males and females and children, and they all have to take off their clothes. They're all being detained by this process, and yet she takes this little clip and she distorts it into trying to make it think that these men in the video game are making her rip off her clothes because she's a woman, when that's not the case at all.
That description of the scene does not match the clip you show. In the clip you show, I see one woman surrounded by many soldiers. She's told to take off her clothes for decontamination. She protests, saying she isn't contaminated, and the soldier responds, "I'm sure of that. More importantly, you're a pretty girl." The soldier is literally saying that, more important than the decontamination process, she is a sexually attractive woman. She does not take off her clothes, as you put it.
This particular scene where she's taking off her clothes...
No, she's not taking them off. It's very clear that the man is ripping them off her against her will. She's then soaked in water before some very satisfied-looking soldiers. The plot with other men and women and children and the official justification of, oh, we need to decontaminate you, when it's clearly not what's most important to the soldiers here. The imagery is evocative of rape. Your argument that Sarkeesian is misconstruing the content of the scene is invalid, because the scene is exactly as Sarkeesian is presenting it, or worse.
Male power fantasies. Interesting choice of words there, Anita. What about female power fantasies? The fact that you only present male power fantasies, isn't that a bit sexist that you don't include the other side? For example, the game Bayonetta.
Sarkeesian's focuses on the imbalance of representation. Even if conceded that Bayonetta is a female power fantasy, despite its appeal to male gamers, it is an outlier. Sarkeesian's point is that the representation is not 50% and 50%. Your single example of Bayonetta makes it, at best, 99% and 1%, under which case Sarkeesian's point still stands.
Did you know that Bayonetta, this particular scene where she uses her hair as a weapon, is also part of her clothing? Yes, her hair is part of her clothing. She reallocates her hair for wicked weaves. This is actually historically based, or I shouldn't say historically, but it's based on the myth/legends of witches who actually use their hair for magic. Also, Anita Sarkeesian, are you in fact aware that the character Bayonetta was designed by, in fact, a woman by the name of, I'm probably butchering this name, but Mari Skimazaki? That's a woman.
Sarkeesian is focused on the sexualized presentation of Bayonetta's ability. The implementation details of that ability within the game's canon is not relevant when scrutinizing the decision of the game designers to use highly sexual imagery. While Mari Shimazaki is indeed the character designer for Bayonetta, what is your intent by bringing this up? If you are challenging Sarkeesian's implication that Bayonetta's design is objectionable, then your position is that Bayonetta's design is not objectionable. Your justification is that the character designer is a woman. I will argue that your argument is insufficient for a couple reasons. First, I found a blog post by Shimazaki describing the design process of Bayonetta. A few things are notable that she writes. When we started Bayonetta, our director Hideki Kamiya asked me to design a character. Hideki Kamiya, her boss in this case, is a man. When a female character appears in an action game, her limbs often seem thin and short. That is why I tried to make her more appealing as an action game character by adjusting her proportions and extending her limbs. Her designs do not exist in a bubble. Bayonetta was designed to be appealing and adhere to expectations in an industry that is dominated by men. I do not want to minimize Shimazaki's creative input or her own personal love for her work, but the point you are trying to make seems to be that Bayonetta's highly sexualized design is okay because it was okay to buy a woman, seeing as how she created the design. While it's not my intention to fully conflate this idea with the following example, this is the same kind of logic behind someone saying to the effect, "No, I'm not racist because some of my best friends are black." In the same way that a single instance of tolerance of an individual's disposition on race does not justify that individual's disposition, if Bayonetta's sexualized presentation is to be in question, Shimazaki's inclusion in the development process of Bayonetta's character design alone does not justify its use.
So before you say words that you don't really know what they mean and say that Mario is misogynistic or sexist against women, or before you say Bayonetta is being misogynistic towards women, by all means, please educate yourself on what real misogyny and real oppression is.
Hold on, buddy. Your criticism highlights a critical misunderstanding both of Sarkeesian's argument in her Damsel in Distress video, as well as the role sexism and misogyny plays in our society. Sarkeesian's intention is not really to highlight individual instances of blatant sexism in video games. Her intention is to highlight the ubiquity in breadth, cross-platform and cross-genre, and depth, through the history of video games, of a single plot device that is strongly gendered and through memetics contributes to gender stereotypes in our culture. Your argument is that Sarkeesian is essentially missing the forest for the trees regarding her identification of misogyny. However, in many ways, blatant examples of sexism and misogyny are not the problem in society, because these instances are trivial to identify and handle. When strongly gendered ideas are presented and transmitted in very subtle ways, that is really the silent killer. That is really the problem. We in Western society face a different set of social challenges than the Arab world. We do not have the luxury to ignore problems at home while making elementary and token stances on issues half a world away. In America, women still make however many cents to the dollar a man makes, and the reasons are incredibly subtle, deep, and come from an innumerable number of sources. And really, through investigations such as Sarkeesian's, that is the best way to bring these sorts of things to light and begin to address them. You are arguing that we should instead focus on blatant misogyny overseas. I would say that we're both right, but you're the only one who is at the same time wrong.
I never once have been interested or attempted to try to grope or sexually harass a woman on a bus by simply playing this game.
Sarkeesian's point is solely in regards to Bayonetta's advertising campaign in the Shinjuku station. She is in no way claiming that the content of the game itself is encouraging sexual assault, but that the advertising campaign is incredibly irresponsible given the larger context of interaction with women that occurs in Tokyo subways. Studies have shown that anywhere between 28.4% and 70% of women that ride the subway in Tokyo have been molested, and it's acknowledged as a major social concern within Japanese society. Sarkeesian's criticism of this advertising campaign is entirely justified. Your defense of this advertising campaign is not.
What Anita Sarkeesian is saying right here is that if a female character attempts to show some sort of resistance towards a male enemy within the video game, their efforts are completely and always meaningless. And in fact, that she will always lose regardless of what she tries to do. As you and me know, there are plenty of video games with females in it, and this is not the case at all in any possible way. Yet she's trying to say that this is the case with all games with females in them.
No. That is a straw man argument. Sarkeesian is focusing on games that use the damsel in distress trope, and is in no way discussing all games with females in them as you describe. The structure of the damsel in distress trope requires that the female character be unable to secure their own escape, such that intervention by the male hero is required. If the plot does not follow this structure, then it is not employing the damsel in distress trope, and it is not a game that is being included in Sarkeesian's analysis. You are describing games in which the damsel in distress trope is not utilized, which says nothing about the games where it is utilized. Therefore, your argument does not address what Sarkeesian is saying and is invalid.
And what's really odd is if that a female character does try to actually help the male protagonist, she simply brushes it off and says that it's only for symbolism.
Yes, because, as she says, they...
and typically only happen after the core adventure is over or the danger has passed. These token gestures of pseudo-empowerment don't really offer any meaningful change to the core of the trope.
Sarkeesian is saying that this particular spin on a damsel in distress trope does not offer a meaningful subversion of the trope. Her term pseudo-empowerment is key here. Your argument from incredulity to counter her point has not been fully justified and is therefore invalid.
What you and me say about a game or a female in a video game will just be completely disregarded because she, in her mind, already has a set mindset of how women should be, act, dress, look, and be represented in games.
In regards to your use of the word should, although clear from the purpose of her video series, Sarkeesian explicitly reaffirms in her videos that she is describing what is and not prescribing what should be in regards to the treatment of gender in games. For example,
So to be clear here, the problem is not the fact that female characters die or suffer. Death touches all of our lives eventually, and as such, it's often an integral part of dramatic storytelling. To say that women could never die in stories would be absurd. But it's important to consider the ways that women's deaths are framed and examine how and why they're written.
In Part 3, Sarkeesian outlines the plot of a game that would be an example of a complete inversion of the damsel in distress trope. Afterwards, however, she reaffirms.
Now, I'm certainly not arguing that all stories must include completely fearless, hyper-individualistic, heroic women who pull themselves up by their bootstraps and never need anything from anyone. Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance. The human impulse to help others in need is certainly not a negative thing. It only becomes a problem when acts of altruism are repeatedly presented in heavily gendered ways that are bound up in harmful myths about women as perpetual victims and men as paternalistic saviors.
In this sense, your concern has been explicitly addressed by Sarkeesian herself.
You actually think that only male gamers can have an emotional reaction to the characters or plot device. I prefer to call them plot devices, not the damsel in distress trope. But when this damsel in distress plot device is in fact used, every gamer, male and female, have an emotional reaction, or can have an emotional reaction.
I agree with you that players of both genders can be emotionally affected by these scenes. However, the key phrase and concept within Sarkeesian's argument here is not male gamers, but female fragility. Sarkeesian's point is that the usage of this trope will reinforce the gendered notion and stereotype of female fragility. I agree with you that people of both genders equally can absorb this. Men will experience and have reinforced and normalized, through effective dramatic presentation, the idea of female physical vulnerability. Women will also experience and have reinforced and normalized, through effective dramatic presentation, the idea of their own physical vulnerability, neuroplasticity, and all that. However, Sarkeesian never claims that only male gamers may experience emotional reactions. Your argument is a straw man and is invalid.
Are you actually saying that if two characters in a video game, a male and female, their relationship blossoms within that video game by the male or female risking their life to save that other character, which I should note, which, by the way, is what you should do in real-life situations? If I have someone I love and care for, and if someone's going to rob them or something, and I jump to their rescue, or defend them, or protect them, that's something that should be done within that relationship if you truly love and care for that person. That protecting or sacrificing somehow reduces or reinforces the idea that a man is superior to that of a woman.
No, that's not what she's saying at all. This is a straw man argument. In the trope you are responding to, Sarkeesian is claiming that in the scenarios where love blossoms amidst the damsel in distress trope, the attracting factor to the woman ends up being her state of being damseled itself. The alarming factor Sarkeesian points out is that her worth as a romantic interest is her vulnerability. It's kind of like how religions have strict gender roles, namely that the woman's place is to be subordinate to the man. You see it in Islam, you see it in Christianity. Based on this idea, a Christian male could feasibly then look for and be attracted to a woman based on how well she adheres to that ideal. In much the same way that is regressive, the idea that the hero falls in love with a woman not because he knows anything about her as a person, but merely because she's in trouble and needs help, and that means she's hot, is regressive in the same way. Secondly, you're incorrect. If someone's getting mugged, do not escalate the situation. You give them what they want and take no actions that may trigger fight or flight in them, that could lead to someone getting hurt. After that, you call the police immediately. Furthermore, these kinds of actions are selfish. Your loved one, who you are trying to defend, cares about your safety just as much as you care about theirs. By irresponsibly escalating the situation into violence and putting yourself into danger, you're being inconsiderate of their feelings.
You go on and listing all of these games, but you provide actually no concrete examples as to why these games, using these tropes, are bad for society or why they shouldn't be occurring.
Sarkeesian provides this.
The reality is, this trope is being used in a real-world context where backward sexist attitudes are already rampant. It's a sad fact that a large percentage of the world's population still clings to the deeply sexist belief that women as a group need to be sheltered, protected, and taken care of by men. The belief that women are somehow a naturally weaker gender is a deeply ingrained, socially constructed myth, which of course is completely false. But the notion is reinforced and perpetuated when women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. But it's undeniable that popular culture is a powerful influence in our lives, and the damsel in distress trope as a recurring trend does help to normalize extremely toxic, patronizing, and paternalistic attitudes about women.
But what Anita doesn't seem to understand is why that is so. Why are these women killed in these video games? In the game Dante's Inferno, for example, Dante's father and wife are killed as a victim in the Crusades in which Dante himself is participating in.
To generate pathos. The bad guys can kill lots of nameless people, but whatever, I mean, you'll kill that many too over the course of the game. When they kill someone close to the main character, though, now that makes it personal. That's what actually motivates the main character, and so begins their quest. Sarkeesian herself shows that, contrary to your claim, she does understand this.
Although these stories use female trauma as the catalyst to set the plot elements in motion, these are not stories about women. Nor are they concerned with the struggles of women navigating the mental, emotional, and physical ramifications of violence. Instead, these are strictly male-centered stories, in which, more often than not, the tragic damsels are just empty shells, whose deaths are depicted as far more meaningful than their lives.
You do a great job of recognizing these sorts of tropes. However, the use of these tropes does not mean that they are misogynistic against women.
We just heard it a second ago, but Sarkeesian agrees with you.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. But it's undeniable that...
This seems to be an example of you misunderstanding her argument. It is incredibly disingenuous to claim Sarkeesian is saying one thing when she, with explicit and unambiguous language, is not.
Would you, in rebuttal to this video, say that this is a cheap, misandric joke towards men? I'm curious.
No. Liz in the game kills the two men essentially because of business. The situation was getting too hot, she took action. It's not gendered in any way because were Liz male, the scene would have played out exactly the same way. Whereas in the GTA 3 clip, the motivation behind them shooting the woman stems from a hypermasculine intolerance of female things like complaining about hair and nails.
They are the ones in control. They are the ones telling the hero, the main protagonist, to end their suffering. So they're asking for it, but they aren't in control. What? That doesn't even make any logical sense.
I agree with you that there is a surface-level logical inconsistency in her words. You're right. However, it is a bit more complicated than that. A critical component of the damsel's consent in her life being ended is that it is being done by the main character, their love interest. You yourself stress the significance of this.
And while you, the player, may have a choice whether to put them out of their suffering or not, usually if you don't choose to kill them, some other character kills them to put them out of their misery.
Now, if it happens anyway, why is it significant that you get the choice? There's an implication that letting someone else do it is less desirable, motivating you to be the one to pull the trigger. The victim in this kind of situation is most comfortable with it being done by the hands of their loved one. Now, there's nothing immediately wrong here. The actions of the hero are correct, and I generally agree with you on your larger discussion of euthanasia. However, the focus of Sarkeesian's point is how this is used within the context of the damsel in distress trope. The damsel in distress trope hinges on the removal of agency from the victim. Sarkeesian's point here is that within instances of the trope, there are variations that do allow the victim some level of agency. Sarkeesian identifies correctly that in a significant subset of these scenarios, they choose, with their agency, to die. In regards to the plot, this is done by the writers to motivate the hero, make it even more personal, motivate them through the final boss, etc. Sarkeesian's point is that whenever this happens, it's always a woman who dies, and it's always a man who pulls the trigger. Why is that? And why would it be, and you and I both know this, so different and so weird and subversive for the roles to be reversed? Why is it that it isn't natural? If your argument is that it is natural, why is it that it's non-existent given how natural you say it is? I'll also say that this doesn't apply to men in the more everyday mercy-killing scenario that you described, such as in this scene from The Last of Us.
Easy. Watch it.
Help me. My mask broke. Don't leave me to turn.
Poor bastard.
The man asks to be shot, but there is not the same level of intimate consent and significance as is presented between main characters, so I would limit the consideration to between main characters.
There are hundreds upon thousands of films in cinema that have very cliché similar plots, but they're completely two different types of movies tackling a different story, but the plot elements are similar. In fact, most movies today that you watch typically use the same sort of plot devices and cliches in them.
Yes. Similarly, there are hundreds upon thousands of games that use the damsel in distress trope. All of them do it a little differently, but the cliché is identifiable. Sarkeesian's point is that the damsel in distress cliché, in practice, has a very strict gender structure. The repeated usage of this cliché establishes itself as a standard trope, but at the same time, the gender structure gets established as well.
The gender role reversal is so unusual that it borders on the absurd. Which is one of the reasons why the scene from Disney's Wreck-It Ralph is so humorous.
The issue Sarkeesian is trying to bring up is that by establishing the cliché and establishing the gender structure, variations on the gender structure become absurd, and then, for example, the idea of a woman wanting to get revenge for their murdered loved one becomes absurd, because that's a male thing to do. This is how women are disempowered by something like this.
Now, with Princess Zelda, she, like Peach, rules her own kingdom. She's a figurehead of considerable respect and power within her own realm. She certainly couldn't be considered Link's property to be won. But moreover, the premise of the Zelda series is for Link as the chosen hero to restore peace and prosperity to the kingdom. Now, it's worth noting that Link goes about saving Zelda and the kingdom by progressively helping any and all citizens of said kingdom with whatever troubles or quests they have for him.
Correct. He saves the kingdom. That's his job. However, for all the significance you place here and later in the video on the importance of Zelda, you, here, note that Link's job in practice is to save the kingdom. Zelda's role in that is being the damsel in distress and motivating Link, making it personal. Zelda's role is not so much as a character.
So, if the requirement to be a damsel is being helpless, how can they be called a helpful damsel?
Because they're not allowed in the plot to help themselves. They can only help the main character. Zelda in Wind Waker can't escape Ganondorf. She does the bouncy arrow trick, but that's about it. The helpful damsel is still a damsel, but enough instances of the trope occur where they can provide this sort of minor support role that it is notable as a subcategory.
If Anita is as concerned for the real problems facing women as she should be, I would suggest that her 160k could have been raised instead to make educational videos that could be helping real women and not to just snipe at the video games industry.
While I've already addressed the notion that focus should always be on problems half a world away, this is notable because I feel the real motivation behind the backlash to Sarkeesian's work is this second point, the idea that she is sniping at the video games industry. My rebuttal is that those who make this argument seem to want to have their cake and eat it too. Gamers want games to be bigger, better, and stronger, from a business standpoint, from a political standpoint, and from a cultural standpoint. We want ubiquity and integration of devices and services. We want games to be strong to stand up to legal challenges and mature enough and taken seriously enough as art to stand up to political challenges from legislators who don't understand games, look down on them, and would censor them. And we want more cultural relevance. Nerdiness is in. Cultural events like PAX and Minecon and esports events are in. But on the other hand, despite how big and important and how much people want games to shape their lives, there's this sense that games are below criticism. For Sarkeesian to question the social implications of certain messages presented in games that otherwise go unnoticed is sniping. Something unfair. Can't have it both ways. If video games are to mature, we need to mature as well.
You describe violence against women as a violent act committed against a woman versus a violent act committed against a woman because she is a woman. Because it has something to do with her specific gender or her sexuality.
Sarkeesian herself says explicitly,
So to be clear here, the problem is not the fact that female characters die or suffer. Death touches all of our lives eventually, and as such, it's often an integral part of dramatic storytelling. To say that women could never die in stories would be absurd. But it's important to consider the ways that women's deaths are framed and examine how and why they're written.
Her stating of this demonstrates that she does indeed understand that it's not automatically a problem whenever any woman suffers violence in a video game. However, within the damsel in distress trope, Women are funneled into this role and made the victim of violence because of their gender, and often role as a love interest. Since a male character could not play the same role with the same significance, this role is strongly gendered and does target women specifically.
Domestic violence is not a woman problem, not a female problem. Domestic violence exists and is a human problem. Something that I've seen with women like yourself, Anita, is you like to think that domestic violence only applies and is applicable to one specific gender, and it's not. It's a human problem, and it's a problem that needs to be fixed, and a problem needs to be solved and addressed.
I'm not sure what you're trying to say here, and I'm not sure why you're motivated to be contrarian to what Sarkeesian is saying here. Are you trying to say that men are the victims of domestic violence too? Is this supposed to be a point against what Sarkeesian is saying? Are you saying she is unjustified in having special concern for women when it comes to topics such as domestic violence and rape? If so, this is a false equivalence. You seem to be attempting to take some kind of moral high ground to Sarkeesian, but all you're doing is minimizing and diminishing the reality of the burden of domestic violence and rape that women in particular suffer in our society.
Can you explain to me, Anita Sarkeesian, why these things, which I would consider ethical in context of a fictional universe, are somehow dangerously irresponsible in the real world?
Sarkeesian makes this point.
The human impulse to help others in need is certainly not a negative thing. It only becomes a problem when acts of altruism are repeatedly presented in heavily gendered ways that are bound up in harmful myths about women as perpetual victims and men as paternalistic saviors.
There's no implication that she is his possession. And the line is, I quote, the line is, "I take from you." He then puts the gun, the villain puts the gun to her head, pops it, kills her. The villain referring to her as his wife does not imply that he considers her property. You have a, well, you and your stupid manipulating words, Anita Sarkeesian, is pathetic.
No, it's pretty clearly implied. Let's look at more of the context.
It just gets bigger and bigger, don't it, Jackie boy? We hurt you, you hurt us. It's like some fucking game we're playing here. You caused me a lot of trouble, boy.
You were my blood, Jackie. I loved you like a son, and you took from me. You stole my respect, and you stole my trust. And when blood takes from blood, someone always pays. So now, I take from you.
Jackie, this is not your fault.
There is no discussion about her being his wife. The main character says she's mine, and then the villain kills her specifically to get back at the main character, apparently. The main character took something from the villain, who will then take something from him. The other character even comments on how it's been this big tit-for-tat sort of deal, and this is just another play in some kind of game. And it's pretty clear. Your criticism that Sarkeesian is unjustified in using this clip is an example of more special pleading that is not grounded and is invalid.
Are you somehow trying to sneakily imply that, or insinuate that men cannot love Anita?
I will agree that Sarkeesian is unjustified in saying that the character's true motivation is only guilt from his own personal failure. However, you do interject your comment into the middle of Sarkeesian's clip from Max Payne 3. In the second part of the clip, Max does say,
"And I hated myself for allowing this to happen to her and our little girl."
Sarkeesian is correct in saying that it is a motivation. She is incorrect in asserting that it is their sole motivation.
Because it seems from this statement that you just said, it's all men's fault yet again. Everything is men's fault. Anita Sarkeesian, I have to ask, do you hate men?
No. She's not saying it is men's fault. What is it supposed to be? I'm not following you. This is not a reasoned argument against any of her points, and you kind of go off the deep end here.
It is harmful to men because it is the sole purpose of having revenge because they have lost their power. The option that maybe they really love or care for the person that they want revenge for, did that ever occur to you?
No, this is irrelevant to Sarkeesian's point. Her point is that by establishing, through repetition of a gendered trope, that men can successfully resolve conflict using violence, this is harmful to men because it gives them the idea to use violence and dissuades them from using other responses. There is a very immediate and apropos example of this.
Which, by the way, is what you should do in real-life situations. If I have someone I love and care for, and if someone's going to rob them or something, and I jump to their rescue, or defend them, or protect them, that's something that should be done within that relationship if you truly love and care for that person.
This is exactly what Sarkeesian is talking about. I should note that when you interjected this into your argument, it felt very unnatural. It felt like you felt some sort of need in the heat of the moment to prove to your audience that you are an altruistic and self-sacrificing individual, that this is one of your values. The problem is that, as I described before, this is terrible advice. By choosing to escalate dangerous situations like this, since there's a good chance that the mugger is going to have a knife or a gun, that kind of shit is going to get you killed. You have about 100,000 views in this video, and 1/8 of a million subscribers. I guarantee you that a lot of your subscribers live in big cities, and a number of them might get mugged in the immediate future. What if they remember your video, fight back, make shit real, and then get themselves killed? In this situation, your adoption of this heroic and courageous and really dangerous ideal is literally harmful. So when you ask how these kinds of messages are harmful to men, well, there you go. In summary, I've demonstrated that MrRepzion has failed to understand and has misrepresented Anita Sarkeesian's message from her Damsel in Distress video series. The arguments he has presented are flawed. I'd very much welcome a response and a discussion. In closing, I did note that on your Facebook page, MrRepzion, that you're going to be at PAX. If you're interested, I'll also be there. If you're interested in meeting and discussing preps over a beer, that'd be great. Looking forward to see what you have to say. Thank you.